species called Anamyticus, which was found in and around this sort of Vietnam area. Sondaicus, the current species, was found through Sumatra up through Peninsular Malaysia, and then there was another species called Inermis, which was found across what is now called Bangladesh, parts of Myanmar, and also northeast India. So they would have numbered literally in the thousands historically. This is part of the Krakatoa volcano complex, which just sits off the north coast of Java. It's still very active. You may remember back in 1883 reading about the famous eruption where the Krakatoa blew its top and sent successive tsunamis and unstable conditions right around the whole range of landscapes there. It wiped out a whole part of Java and wiped out many thousands of people. And it was actually quite a well recorded event. There was captains that were in boats out at sea that actually recorded seeing, floating tigers and all sorts of weird wildlife floating past that have been wiped out in the tsunami. It's quite an amazing historic read. So just a bit of background to the thesis. So there's 5 research chapters, and the first research chapter is just about local community awareness. I did some survey work. Second chapter is on frontline management, where I actually talked to the rangers that are actually doing the frontline management. Then I looked at Arenga palm, which is an invasive species that's having a great impact on habitat. Then I looked at the importance of wallows. Rhinos have a daily requirement to wallow. They're a very important component of their ecology. And I also looked at their social behaviour and communication. But the operating environment is quite significant. Java, Indonesia is the most populated island on Earth, currently 153 million people and growing. Local people are predominantly Muslim, very patriarchal, typically a very low literacy and income, and certainly the community that lives around Ujong Kulong National Park has a very heavy reliance on national park resources just to live and exist. So they rely on bushmeat and forest resources to do that. Ujong Kulong sits in the Western Banten province, which is one of 36 provinces across Indonesia. Current population is over 15 million. And yeah, you're talking well over about 1,100 people per square kilometre, so people are really packed in. It still remains a very seismically and volcanically active part of the world. So on average, they're having one tsunami every 12 months. There was one late last year that wiped out about 400 people and did a whole heap of damage to the national park. So that's an ongoing challenge in that part of the world. As I mentioned earlier, it's a World Heritage listed national park. There is no free access to the park. It's all controlled. There's a controlled permit system. And you are typically, when I visit, I have 4 armed guards with me. The theory is if someone breaks a leg, well, the other 4 of us can carry someone out. So everything's on foot. Climate is typically hot tropical. I've never been there and not been wet. It rains perpetually. Average rainfall is about 3.5 metres, but it can get up to 5 metres. So it's quite an extreme environment. And as I mentioned earlier, the landscape is typically broadleaf evergreen, mostly primary and secondary forest with lots of small interdispersed with all these sort of small rivers and waterways and a lot of coastal mangrove and stuff as well. So one of the, while I'm not a social researcher, I was quite keen to get to know the local community and just get a bit of understanding on what they understood of the Javan rhino in the national park. So I was able to, over a period of roughly 12 months, interview 76 local villages, the village leader and 3 people from each of the 19 villages that surround the national park. And because of their low literacy, and obviously I speak English and my Bahasa is pretty dodgy, I was able to get an interpreter to come with me, so we just rode around on motorbikes, so it was good fun. And at the time, the village population around the eastern edge of the national park was around 63,000 people. It's upwards, as of now, it's upwards of over 100,000 people. These are all people living right on the boundary of the national park. So what did we find out? We basically found out that that these communities didn't have a great deal of knowledge of what was going on with the national park. They didn't know what the numbers were. They didn't really understand the national park operations. So that was a really good exercise. And as a direct result of this, after we got some results, and I was able to talk to the National Park authorities, and they actually ended up employing a community liaison person to actually regularly go to local community meetings and start talking about, what's been happening, what's some of the control works, and what the Javan rhinos are doing and how they're being monitored. That's just a picture of just an image of the all the village precincts around the eastern edge of the national park. Typical population size is about 2.5 to 5.5, 6,000 people per village, all living in extended families. So you can have up to 5 generations living in a village complex. So it's quite very family oriented. That's one of the local ladies we did an interview. That's Apui. He was my interpreter. So we just had a survey questionnaire, and we worked through that with a really good fun exercise, good thing to do. And because I've been doing this for over the 6-year journey of the thesis, I really got to know local communities and actually was able to employ them to do some of the work in the national park and the research work, which was great. This is a very typical site. This is happening thousands of times a day, where you have local villagers going into the national park and cutting green timber, rainforest timber. They take it back to their huts and they actually put it on a cool fire and turn it into charcoal for heating. So there's really high scope to get solar and all that sort of stuff in these communities down the track, because so they're using obviously a lot of forest resource, just the fundamental things like cooking and keeping the insects down in their hut. This is a typical community rice field right on the edge of the national park. These are all done by various villages, so they work those pretty much year round. But you get that edge effect, so there's a lot of sort of subtle take of rainforest area and increase the area of cultivation. So in chapter 3, I was able to, because I was working with the rangers quite closely, I was able to interview 22 of the 25 RPUs, or rhino protection staff, that are employed through philanthropic sources, and they work with the national park rangers. So typically what happens is a 4-man patrol will go out. There's typically always someone in the field at any given time, but they're spending on average 20 days in the national park, obviously checking for poachers and all that. So they managed to stop poaching. They're poaching. There's certainly poaching of bantang cattle, which is an endangered bovid species, and some of the other species such as leopard and deer, mostly for subsistence, for food. But rhinos haven't been taken out of the system since about 1998. I was very interested to know what the threats were that the staff considered, and the frontline staff, more than 50%, about 53, noted that they felt the biggest risk to the current rhino population was disease risk from domestic stock. So, for example, historically there's been outbreaks of anthrax. They have hemorrhagic septicemia, brucellosis, name a bovid disease, and it's been there. And of course, these are people often in poverty that may have a herd of domestic buffalo. They graze illegally in the park. They don't do any normal vaccinations and all that. So it's a big challenge. So that was their biggest disease risk, was they considered the key threat. And of course, then you've got the whole combined threats of obviously human encroachment, illegal poaching, things like wild honey, various birds, and so it's quite a significant combination of things that they're quite concerned about. That's very typical of the boys on patrol. They've got a steel cable. West Javan wedding ceremonies require a bantang sacrifice. A bantang is an endangered bovid, and that's been set up to catch them. So they regularly catch locals snatching bantang. There's quite healthy populations of bantang in the national park, which no doubt would probably compete with, would be actually a good research project to look at the competition between bantang and Javan rhino. But yeah, that's very typical of when you're out on patrol, what you might find and have to dismantle. That's the operating environment. You've got to be pretty fit. You've got to climb over things to get around. It's obviously wet and slippery, but that's very typical of what the sort of landscape you're operating in. Historically, the only way that you could really monitor the rhinos was through identification of footprints. Direct observation of rhino is really difficult. In the 6 years I've been visiting, I've only seen the backside of a rhino disappear off into the jungle. You just don't get close to them enough to see them. So there's a heavy reliance on camera traps. But historically, the rangers used to carry 50, 60 kilo bags of plaster of Paris around, and they would make these footprints and use them as identification sources. So I'm glad we've moved into the modern world. And as you can see, we now they set up cameras. So all those red dots are a camera. There's a permanent setup of 120 cameras in that section of the park, which is where the main rhino population is. So on a monthly patrols, the rangers go out and they download the memory sticks. And what I was able to broker as part of my research permit was to get access to that camera trap footage. So the actual amount of rhino footage from those clips is very low. It's about 3% of the total take, but I still ended up getting 400 to 500 30-second clips, which was pretty valuable to have a look and see what they do. The concern over the disease risk from stock was recognised at quite a high level, and they ended up building this 8-kilometre rhino-proof fence. On the right-hand side is the national park, and the left-hand side is the village sort of edge. So that's maintained by the national park and rhino protection staff. They still have breaches where the locals will put domestic buffalo into the park and use wallows and all sorts of local feed sources, but it has been working quite effectively. So this was a significant chapter. This chapter 4 was on understanding the implications for Arenga palm. Arenga palm is a native species with invasive qualities, and it appears when the Krakatoa eruption occurred in 1883 that it provided conditions for this palm to really take over. So I obviously formulated a number of research questions about the implications of Arenga palm dominated habitat for rhino habitat use and distribution, and what happens when you remove the Arenga palm. Does it increase the availability of food plants? Looking at the time period on which actual rhino food plants grow. It's probably worth mentioning now that rhinos are very attracted to disturbance regimes. So in a normal jungle environment, a rainforest tree would fall over and obviously crash to the ground. It would open up the floor of the forest to sunlight and germination opportunities, and of course you get all this emergent growth, and that's the ice cream that the rhinos like to taste. So part of the reason why I wanted to get to know local community, because I actually employed them to come in and cut the palm for me. So that's a cool example of the palm. Very dominant, has subterraneous roots, produces a lot of fruit, dominates the canopy, and basically excludes growth opportunities for other normal rainforest plants. Produces a lot of fruit there, which is fed on by a whole suite of native animals, including some of the larger bird species like hornbills. That's an early Landsat image. All that red area is Arenga palm, so you can see that's potentially lost rhino habitat. So it is a significant impact on the rhinos. We do know that I've often seen these guys. This is an Asian palm civet, Paradoxurus hermaphroditus, which is a cat-sized carnivore that likes to feed on fruit. So that's in a ficus tree, but it also feeds on Arenga palm fruit. And these guys, these are long-tailed macaques, Macaca fascicularis. I have a suspicion that there's been a change, well, there would be a change to the trophic levels in Ujong Kolong. Javan tiger were taken out of the system in about 1980. There was no more tigers left by about 1980, and I suspect that tigers were, their removal caused the local Javan leopards to probably move from feeding on palm civets and macaques to some of the deer species, and so it's obviously produced less predation of the Arenga palm fruit. So yeah, that'll be another interesting thing to look at, some of the trophic changes since taking out an apex predator like the tiger. So this is just a an aerial map of where I ended up clearing 15 1-hectare sites of monoculture Arenga palm. That's all the blue dots. The pink dots, I had 15 control sites, which were as near as close to normal jungle as possible. I was able to get local communities. We shared it around for them to come in for about $1,000 a hectare. They would come in and cut the Arenga palm by hand. They aren't allowed to use chemicals, so which was a shame. And over a 2-year period, I was able to monitor what happens when you cut the palm and how soon, what happens and how soon the rhinos would move in. So that's what a cleared Arenga plot looks like. It's monoculture. And over time, it would come back. You can see everything you're basically looking at there. That's the Arenga palm stumps, is all rhino food plants. And then proof of concept is when a rhino actually turns up. So that's in a cleared Arenga palm site that's grown back. The male has been in there feeding. So it works. You can see how quickly they disappear. They're just like grey ghosts. You wouldn't know there was a rhino there, would you? So basically, yeah, so we cleared the sites, obviously did a whole range of analytical work on it, ran ANOVAs and two-tailed t-tests on comparing it. So recorded variables included number of plants and stems per quadrat. I had each 1-hectare site was broken down into 20 square metre quadrats. And I just really recorded the number of plant species, number of plant families, number of plants and stems per quadrat, and also how soon the rhinos moved in. Typically, a cleared site had rhino visitation within 4 weeks. And over the 2-year period, the cleared sites, I ended up recording 67 rhino food plant species from 37 plant families, and the control sites had 71 rhino food plants and 41 plant families. So very similar outcomes from clearing, which is good. So basically the plant growth was very rapid. Once you opened up that monoculture of cleared palm to sunlight and the elements, the natural seed bank of native plants came back really quickly, and the rhinos are actually using those sites. Rhinos communicate through spray urination, their dung. Obviously they vocalise, and they also have what are called pedal scent glands in their hooves, which they secrete a secretion that they communicate with as well. So in chapter 5, sorry I'm rushing along here, in chapter 5 I examined the importance of wallows to Javan rhino conservation and ecology. So I recorded over a couple of year period 35 wallows, recorded everything about their characteristics and looked at some of the interaction. I had some cameras set up on wallowing sites, and I basically hypothesised that Javan rhinos utilise wallows not only for thermoregulation but also as sites of interaction and communication. So that's a very typical wallow. It's actually created by the rhinos. They typically start off with a bank, and they actually use their horn and bulk to shape the wallow itself. And over time, they develop into quite substantial pieces of infrastructure that the rhinos use quite regularly. So all those green dots are actually wallows. So yeah, we looked at distances. We looked at a whole range of variables. This is very typical bit of wallowing behaviour. So this is a female with a calf. You'll see the calf turn up in a minute. You can see there's a bank in the background, so they've dug out on the side of a hill. Yep, that's just a young male calf. They really like to wallow, as you'll see from the next image. Oops, sorry, I'll go back one. So they will wallow for up to 6 hours. So the average wallowing duration is about 2.5 hours, but anywhere from 15 minutes to 6 hours. And they really just enjoy that getting coated in that lovely mud. And also these are obviously sites that are used by a number of different animals. And over time I discovered that, I'll just show you this as well. We started picking up some vocalisations from rhinos using rye. So this is just You'll hear a vocalisation coming up from the calf. That's a 3/4 grown calf, female calf. You hear that's sort of like a frog call. It's quite amazing. So we started recording a range of vocalisation. So over the 2-year period, we got 35 wallows. We sorted out. We spatially mapped them all, and we've got a whole heap of baseline characteristics. So typically, the rhinos at the wallows have 75% shade cover, usually elevation above 30 metres. Mud depth and water depth is obviously highly variable. The average wallow was, between 3 metres to about 3 metres wide and 3 metres in width. Got relatively even wallow use patterns from early morning, afternoon and evening. And obviously, as I mentioned earlier, they'll wallow between 15 minutes and 6 hours. So through recording at wallows, setting up cameras and getting some recordings, we actually started picking up some behavioural patterns, and and certainly at wallows, we picked up 7 vocalisation descriptors, and we developed sonograms, which is the first time this has ever been done. And we found that the call frequency range between 100 hertz and 12 kilohertz, so quite a diverse frequency range. And we found that individual vocalisation recorded wallows were much higher than just say an animal just moving around in forest. So they're using wallow sites as communication hubs. So in the last chapter, we actually using video clips, we started trying to get some handle on what's the social structure of Javan rhino, what sort of specific interactions were occurring, how they actually communicate, and what is their sort of vocal repertoire. So this is a bit of courtship behaviour between a male and a young female. You'll hear a bit of vocalisation happening. That's the female, that's called a moo bray. It's only made by females. Go to the next slide. So I'll just put this is a calf with a female. I just want to... That's the calf calling to the female. So eventually lays down and suck it. So we're able to get all these good recordings. So just a summary of findings. Apologies for the phone call in the background. So I ended up reviewing over 390 to 30-second camera trap videos. We were able to categorise 11 behavioural patterns. We found that adult male and female rhinos were mostly solitary, and solitary females and females with calves were very vigilant at wallows because they're often visited by males. And also in forests. So I've got some quite good videos of interactions with males approaching females with calves. We found that often subdominant males, because we reckon that adult male rhinos are reproductively viable about between 10 and 15 years of age, where they've got sufficient bulk and size, body size, that they can actually combat other males for the right mating rights to females. Males will approach females with a short pant vocal. It's sort of a very high intensity repeated short pant, and they will use a phlegm response as well. And as I mentioned earlier, that rhinos are communicating through dung deposition. They actually spray urinate. It's when when they urinate, it's spread out on an arc. It's up to 5 metre arc, and it's quite pungent. You certainly know it when you walk through it when you're in the forest. Pedal scent glands, which are these glands we don't know a great deal about these pedal scent glands, but they are a scent gland in the sole of their pads on their feet. I suspect dominant males would secrete scent when they're in dominant mode and they're setting up territories, and of course we know that they vocalise. So in total, we ended up finding 8 vocalisations, and the call frequency range was still at that. So that's pretty much the talk and tag. I'm sorry I rushed through it. Obviously, like to acknowledge Salit for guiding me through this, and I had Dr. Dewan Biggs as well as helped me a lot, particularly with the social research work, and Professor Ann Golderson was part of my team as well before she retired. So yeah, so that's a good healthy forest, and that's the end.